I'm really only having pig feeding and maybe half a meal a day if I could squash it in, and of course all the coke that I still drink. But yeah, you know, it was kind of a, well, if I didn't get a transplant, I kind of had, well, I mean, even the middle of last year, they were giving me, you know, I was that crook, they were giving me, you know, sort of weeks, if I was lucky. But thankfully I managed to sort of pull it out of my backside and kept up some quite good health, and by the time I actually went into the op, I got my lung function back up to 21%, and I'd actually managed to regain another 10 kgs just through fairly religious sort of pig feeding and whatnot. Good old 2-cal, as lovely as it is. But yeah, no, certainly if it wasn't for that, things would have been a lot worse, that's for sure. So this is actually, what was it, I think about June last year, this is when I got my first transplant call up. Unfortunately, you know, we got up there and it didn't go ahead, which was a bit of a blow. You know, it wasn't exactly easy to take, but you just had to keep in your head that, well, you know, they'd told you that told me that the lungs had deteriorated, so if they'd put them into me, they would have killed me. So hey, certainly better to go home, come back and try again later. And in fact, and do that another 10 times than get the wrong set of lungs, isn't it? And certainly, ultimately, I did. That's for sure. So I always like throwing this one in, just because, of course, actually having that good old surgical nappy to put on was one of those rather amusing, light-hearted moments in the middle of it all. But also, this particular picture, I guess, just sort of showed you just how thin I was at the time. You know, this is what being 6 foot tall and 55 kgs looks like, basically. Thankfully, my shoulders don't stick out quite that much anymore. So yeah, again, same thing. Just another picture of the old nappy. And again, that was still the first transplant call-up that didn't go ahead. But in hindsight, as I said, a good thing, that's for sure. Because given how rocky it ultimately was, if that one had gone ahead, I don't think I would have made it anyway, realistically. But the actual night came, and I got the call. This was here the 18th of December last year. I got the call, and it was about 7:15. Get on the phone to Air New Zealand and get to the airport. And of course, who should be sitting at the airport waiting to go to Auckland but our lovely friend Dr. Doran sitting in the corner there. Who, no, I guess that was just meant to be, wasn't it? Especially since at that point we didn't actually know that we needed paperwork to take with us to have oxygen going on the plane, because every other time I've been on, no one had sort of said anything about it or whatever, but suddenly they're going, okay, so where's your paperwork? And so even with having Mum being, you know, a nurse, Dr. Doran being right there saying, hey, look, what do you want me to sign? They still almost weren't going to let me on the plane. But ultimately, they finally did. And of course, once I actually got on the plane, the air hostess is like, oh yeah, it's a box cylinder, cool. And that was it, you know. No one told the pilot or anything, and so, you know, all this great big drama, and in the end, no one actually cares. And of course, the wheelchair that I'd ordered at the other end, did that turn up? But of course, I wasn't exactly waiting around for that, was I? So I just jumped off the plane and hoofing it down the old alleyways there. Dr. Doran, I think, ran ahead to get a wheelchair for me, but by the time he'd grabbed it, I'd actually caught up to him, and I was just already jumping over the barrier to get into a taxi. So I certainly wasn't waiting around, that's for sure. But yeah, so we ended up getting to the, I mean, from the time I got the call to the time I got to the hospital was about an hour and a half in the end, which was quite good. And you have to get there quickly because, of course, you just don't know how soon your donor lungs are actually going to turn up. And of course, they have to minimise the amount of time that they actually spend out of you, because, I mean, I think they've got like about I think the coordinator said about a 6-hour life, or no, yes, 6 to 10 hour life, sort of actually outside of the patient, before it just becomes too dangerous to actually transplant them still. But yeah, in the end, after getting there so quickly, it wasn't until 5 in the morning, of course, that they actually wheeled me into theatre. But sure enough, you know, as I say, 5 o'clock, the anaesthetist comes in, sticks a drip in my arm and says, right, you know, once we put this in, that's it, you know, you're going out and there's no turning back. And so I just said to him, right, just do it. And I was out to it. So the next 6 days kind of went by with me in a coma. You don't normally spend 6 days in a coma when you have a transplant op, but that unfortunately is just because, well, mine was pretty much the hardest lung transplant op they've done in this country, at least anyway. My my right lung was the hardest explant they've ever done, so in other words, removal. They were literally having to scrape little bits of the lung itself off the side of my cavity, just because it was so sticky because of all the sticky mucousy gunk and whatever that you have throughout your body when you have CF. I also had an encapsulated cavity in my right lung that was full of staph that of course just happened to burst open during the op, which meant I got a massive staph infection in my bloodstream on the table itself, which of course helped with the massive internal bleeding. And just for good measure, I decided to actually kind of check out for at least a few seconds somewhere as well and have some multiple organ failures, so they had to actually quite literally reboot me at some point. So pretty much every possible complication that you can have during transplant surgery, I kind of had. And unfortunately that seems to be the way for me. I always seem to do things the hard way. I don't know why, but such is life. So I spend the next 6 days in a coma, and 4 of them on the old ECMO bypass machine, and that's even after them having to rush me back into theatre at least twice to open me back up again and try and fix some of the internal bleeding that I kept having that they just couldn't stop otherwise. But never mind, I got there in the end. Where are we up to? So yeah, pretty much at that time, of course, my family's all out in the waiting room, just kind of shitting themselves, let's face it. There's not really a lot they could do for me other than pray, and the doctors were sort of saying, hey look, I mean, you know, we can't put blood thinners through the ECMO machine because of all the internal bleeding he's having. So it's kind of a catch-22. On one hand, the blood could clot up in the machine. On the other hand, he could keep hemorrhaging with internal bleeding. So it was really a case of every hour is a good hour. And even here you can see that although my eyes look like they're open, that's actually just because of the amount of edema that I'd taken on during the op itself. I actually put on 10 kgs worth of displaced fluid just during the op itself, which took a good month or so to just sort of slowly pee out afterwards. So yeah, 6 days later, which funnily enough happened to be Christmas Day, they wake me up, and I remember coming to and the nurse standing over me saying, would you like some morphine? Although, you know, the funny thing was that they tell you that you're supposed to have some pain, but actually I had none. You know, I mean, they also tell you too that you're supposed to, you wake up with an epidural in you, but because they can only leave it in for 5 days, it means that being woken up 6 days afterwards, that of course I never had one at all. So of course I'm lying there going, okay, wait a minute, you've just told me that I haven't had an epidural. So where's all this extraordinary amount of pain I was expecting? But the funny thing is, I've actually met, you know, other transplant recipients. I mean, even the lady who had one a couple of weeks before me that had no pain from the cavity, the wound itself either. So, you know, yay for me. But hey, I still had a couple of shots of morphine anyway, just